In the following short interview, tutoring expert Stuart Adams shares with us which aspects of learning have the most powerful impact on our children's academic performance. You'll learn how the most successful people use their minds and how we can use these strategies in our children to help them awaken, develop, and nurture their true potential for excellence.
I think realistically, very few people actually ever reach their true potential in life. I think no matter how good you do in life, there is always something deeper inside of you that's just sort of waiting to have the right trigger, to come out, to become greater. Ever since I was a child, I always had this sort of fascination with trying to figure out what it was that was different between the people who did the absolute best at something and everybody else. And what I used to do was I used to observe and very closely study athletes, for example, my favourite sporting heroes, and I'd try and figure out exactly what it was that they were doing that was different from the rest. Because I figured that you're not born brilliant at something. You're not naturally just born the best at something. You've got to get to that stage. So when you think about the best people, whether it's in sport or in a particular area of science or academia, or some of the greatest thinkers throughout history, when you think of those, the absolute best of those people, they weren't always the best. Something happened in between the time when they were growing up and that time that they actually reached that point. And it's in trying to figure out what it was that led them from point A to point B that I've always thought that if we can figure out what that is and we can sort of, replicate that, then we can role model their particular behaviours and their particular strategies and their techniques. Then when I became a teacher and a careers advisor and obviously a dad, it becomes a particularly appropriate then to try and figure out how we can apply those strategies to our kids, our students, the people that we care about, and how we can get them from the point where they are now to the point where one day they're going to want to be. When we look at the greatest minds and the most successful people, and we look at what they do differently, it essentially all comes down to the way that they use their brains. And it's partly to do with the way that they think towards things, and very much to do with the way that they feel or use emotional connections towards what they're doing that affects the way that they think towards it. And it's getting that emotional side of the brain and the cognitive, the thinking side of the brain working in sync. That's when people who are good at something all of a sudden become people who are great at something and then go on to become the absolute best at it.
But the brain does much more than just recollect. It intercompares, it synthesizes, it analyzes, it generates abstractions.
Thinking is a bit like exercise in a way. You can do some brisk walking, or you can hit the gym full on and do some really intensive exercise. Now, which one do you think is going to make you fitter and stronger? It's kind of obvious, isn't it? Now, these higher order thinking processes, they go a bit above the level of simply recalling or remembering information and being able to demonstrate a basic sort of understanding and applying that understanding. It involves analytical thinking, being able to break things down and separate concepts into chunks, I suppose you could say, and comparing the different chunks of information, comparing one chunk with another chunk, looking at what's similar, what's different. That's analytical thinking, all right? That's the first step to higher order thinking. Then you've got to be able to use evaluative thinking, which means making decisions based on those analyses. And at the highest level of thinking, you've got to be able to use those evaluations to then generate or synthesize original ideas, new concepts. So if we look at people who are leaders in their field, they're people who have been able to analyze something, make evaluations about it, and then come up with their own original and unique ideas. So people who can do this are able to sort of see the finer details, but also zoom back and see the bigger picture at the same time and make them important decisions. So if we compare the way that, say, for example, a CEO thinks compared to someone who is down the bottom of the chain, or an army general, the way that they have to think compared to an entry-level private in the defence. So basically anyone up the top of the chain who gets paid a lot more than someone down the bottom, it's because they use their brain in this way, and it's higher order thinking that makes the biggest difference. Now, of course, as a teacher, this becomes obvious during exams, assessment tasks, especially the HSC exams, when we look at the questions that are worth the most amount of marks compared to the ones that are worth the least amount of marks. And the ones that are worth the least amount of marks usually ask you to use processes like recollection, remembering things and demonstrating a basic understanding. But the questions that carry the heaviest weighting in the assessment tasks are the ones that ask you to analyse, evaluate something, and especially come up with your own, original ideas. Use creative thinking. So when we look at the way, things operate out in the real world, it comes as no surprise then why HSC assessment tasks are set up in this way. It's set up to differentiate the good students from the great students, and the ones who sort of might pass exams, go on to hold down a job, from those who go on to get into the particular uni course that's the most competitive, and the ones who go on to become the leaders, the experts, etc. So how do we train our children to exercise their higher order thinking muscles? Well, for starters, you've got to use the right activities. You wouldn't go into the Olympics training for a powerlifting event by doing marathon running every day. You're going to be wasting your effort. So the smart approach is to make sure that you're using the right activities to train the right cognitive processes. So for starters, we need to make sure that they are learning around a constructivist framework. Now, a constructivist framework basically means that when we're learning something, when we're teaching something, it needs to be done in a way so that the brain can connect what is being taught with something that it already understands. Okay, so it's learning one piece of information that's connected to an existing piece of information already understood, one step at a time. Otherwise, it's like trying to put a jigsaw puzzle together that has overlapping pieces or missing pieces. You're going to get a completely blurred picture. The other thing is, it's vitally important to realise that different people learn in different ways. For example, you might be right-handed or left-handed. Let's say, for example, you're right-handed. You can still use your left hand, but obviously your right hand is going to be stronger. So if you are right-handed, for example, let's say you go into a competition where everything you have to do is left-handed. It's going to make you feel like you're at a disadvantage. If it's too much of a struggle, how do you think it's going to make you feel towards those particular activities? Is it going to generate a lot of confidence? Is it going to give you a really great, motivated attitude towards it? No, not at all. It's going to have the complete reverse effect. So it's important that we realise that some people learn better visually by seeing pictures and diagrams, or they have to generate a picture in their head to be able to really understand it. Other people learn better sequentially or logically by breaking information down into a step-by-step process. Some people learn better by listening, they're audio learner. A lot of people learn better by doing something hands-on, something that they can actually touch and see in front of them, something that they can physically interact with, something that they can construct or move around with their hands and feel. To a lot of people, things only really make sense if they can do it hands-on. So if we want to get the best out of our children's learning capacity, we need to adjust the way in which they're taught according to the way in which they learn best. And in a classroom environment where different students learn in different ways, it starts to become obvious that the way in which we can do this best is one-on-one.
I'm convinced that the only thing that kept me going was that I loved what I did. You've got to find what you love, and that is as true for work as it is for your lovers. Your work is going to fill a large part of your life, and the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do.
The number one thing which guides the direction that we take in life more than anything, whether we're aware of it or whether we're not, and usually we're not, it really comes down to emotion. And it's the emotional connections that we draw with something which is either good for us or bad for us that ultimately determines the path that we take. If we look at those who have done greater than those around them, it's almost always because of the passion and the emotional connection that they had with that particular thing, which was the driving force that, pushed them to the top. It makes absolute sense now, especially that we understand the physiological effects that stress hormones play on the brain. Okay, so we've essentially got these two opposite ends of the scale. where on the one hand we've got severe psychological stress and trauma. During states of extreme trauma, the brain essentially shuts down. You can't access memories, you can't think clearly, you can't use your cognitive and reasoning processes properly. You know when you see athletes get towards the end of a marathon and they've pushed themselves so hard their muscles start to cramp up and they can't even move their legs properly? This is essentially like trying to use your brain under extreme states of stress and trauma, where you're approaching something you have no interest in, you have a complete dislike, you're stressed out, you approach it with anxiety. On the other end of the scale, however, we have this sort of state of extreme confidence and passion. When you're in this state of mind, you can achieve a lot more than what you can if you're anywhere along the scale towards this end. You've probably known this process yourself in some ways, where you've been either browsing, say, something like YouTube or Wikipedia, depending on whether you prefer reading or visual and video type content. And all of a sudden, you might have been distracted by what you were supposed to be doing. You've been distracted by these articles, websites, or videos, and you've been learning all these things kind of accidentally. And then you sit back and think, yeah, I was kind of wasting my time. I was a bit of a distraction from what I was supposed to be doing. But in the process, you're kind of learning accidentally, weren't you? Because when there's a particular personal relevance or interest in that thing, your mind just automatically draws you in that direction. So if you're approaching something you don't like or you don't have an interest in, your mind's automatically going to guide you towards the thing which you have a greater emotional connection with. So the trick then becomes to create a situation where the student develops a greater emotional connection with what it is they're actually supposed to be learning. Okay, so we can develop a personal interest, a personal passion, and especially, and this is the biggest thing, is confidence. The confidence versus the fear factor makes the absolute biggest difference, more than anything. I cannot stress that enough, okay? When you approach something with confidence and it makes you feel, I'm the king of the world, that is automatically going to drive the neurons into that higher order thinking process in the brain. You try and use the creative thinking processes when it comes to something that you either dislike, you hate, you have no confidence in, your brain's just not going to work the same way. It's like trying to race uphill with weights attached to your ankles and jump hurdles at the same time. When, however, you approach something that you have a personal attachment to, when it makes you feel confident, when it makes you feel good about what you're doing, well, then it's like taking off the weights, it's like lowering the hurdles a bit, and all of a sudden the incline becomes a decline. You're actually racing downhill, and you do it automatically without realizing that you're doing that sort of accidental learning process. And if we're smart about it, and we can use these processes that we observe in the way that people who naturally do well at something do, we can apply these with our kids and with our students, and we can make learning happen so naturally that they love doing it, and we get those higher order thinking processes in the brain happening, switched on, just naturally happen. So how do we actually do this? I mean, this sounds great in theory, but how do we apply this in the real world? Well, firstly, we absolutely must do it on a one-on-one basis. A classroom environment is necessary when it comes to the school system, but realistically, if we're going to get the most out of a student's learning potential, it has to be done on that one-on-one process, and it has to be done in a comfortable and familiar environment that absolutely minimizes those stress hormones and absolutely maximizes the support, and the student really needs to feel like this is all about me, and no matter what happens, I'm completely comfortable and relaxed, and I'm in a supportive, sort of nurturing environment where there's no fear of failure. If I don't understand something, it doesn't matter right now, because I know that I will understand it within a few processes from now.